Hi, everyone. So, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about what ended up happening during the Islamic conquests, specifically that period after the death of the Prophet Muhammad for the first 20 or 30 years, and actually kind of continued extending for about 100 years, in which the political space or territory of the new community of believers greatly expanded to include all sorts of new places outside of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, when we speak about this, we're always playing with the idea of images of sort of the conquest of the barbarians of Rome. We have an image of the movement of Muslims or barbarians as some sort of destruction of civilization. And this is often brought about in images from the 19th century and continuing today with the idea that Muslims are taking over Europe or taking over America or the West, et cetera, et cetera. This, of course, this painting is a 19th century vision of the fall of the Roman Empire as the barbarians came streaming in, the course of by Thomas Cole. And often in the historiography, that is the writing of history as a whole, the Muslims have been, or the coming of Islam has marked essentially the end of classical antiquity, the end of a moment in which Rome stood supreme around the Mediterranean, and it kind of supposedly cut off the Middle East from the other side of the Mediterranean. So on one hand, you had, Christian Europe and its civilization. On the other hand, you had the Islamic Middle East and its civilization or non-civilization in their vision. Now, what we're going to be doing is essentially keeping this vision of conquest and the influx of so-called barbarians or Arabs or nomads or whatever in mind, and we're going to put it to the side because we're going to find out that basically this isn't really true, that a lot of this is just a discourse around the fall of empires and the nature of what is civilization. But when we actually go and look at the evidence about what happened during these conquests, there's a very different picture, especially when we look at the archaeological record. Here's another painting, provenance of which I forgot, but another 19th century painting in which one of the Roman cities is being sacked. And here we can see even some of the invaders are depicted in sort of some sort of stereotypical North African Islamicish or Arabish type of garb. Now, remember, we're talking about the early Islamic campaigns at the point which the Prophet Muhammad has died, and the community now united begins, it's kind of pulled into a whole variety of different fights, initially to control the nomadic populations in Iraq and Syria, and this leads it to confront the armies of the Sasanians and Byzantines, defeat those, and then ultimately take control of essentially Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Persia. Now, in the process of that, the question is always, well, what were the conquests like for the people there? Was it a violent conquest? If so, how? Obviously, it was violent in the sense of two armies meeting. But what was the impact on daily life for people themselves? And specifically, what role did religion play? Is this can we think of this as a sort of conquest of Arab tribes over this region? Or was it a so-called Islamic conquest? Often we use the term interchangeably, but these are two different visions of motivation. One in which the motivation is primarily material, the other which is ideological or religious. And sometimes, as we'll see, those two visions actually overlap, and so forth. And ultimately, what evidence do we actually have for the conquest at the time? Now, probably we have, of course, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, the Sirah, which gives us in early chronicles, which give us a good amount of detail. But as always, we want to get multiple perspectives, and one of the places that historians like to look for perspective is in the work of Syrians, Syriacs, and Coptic and Armenian Christians in the Middle East and see what they actually have to say about this stuff. And if we look at those sources, one, they do actually say commonly that that there is obviously a set of attacks, that Muhammad is a real person, and that he's leading or a group of nomads, or those nomads are affiliated with him or under his leadership, whether he's alive or dead. So, for example, that text of Thomas the Presbyter, the earliest, right around 640, we have some information in which it tells us specifically that the nomads of Muhammad, Tayaya is apparently the Syriac word for nomads. And so it's emphasis on nomads and specifically of Muhammad. So there is actually a clear figure of Muhammad. It says, there was a battle between the Romans and the nomads in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. The Romans fled, leaving behind the patriarch Birdin, whom the Tayaya or the nomads killed. Some 4,000 poor villagers of Palestine were killed there, Christian, Jews, and Samaritans. The Tayaya ravaged the whole region. Another Coptic homily. Coptic would be the language spoken by Christians in Egypt, basically a continuation of sort of ancient Egyptian. Of 640, so again, right around the same time, speaks of Saracens. Saracens is one of the classical names given to Muslims or Arabs living in the region, who are oppressors. The Saracens, who are oppressors, who give themselves up to prostitution, massacre, and lead into captivity the sons of men, saying, we both fast and pray. So on one hand, we have widespread report of attacks, of people being killed or taken into captivity. But at the same time, we also have, in this case, a clear emphasis that they saw themselves as a religious community, unified by certain rituals. Now, that's the Christian sources, but we get a different picture if we look at the archaeological evidence. And if you were to think about what would a conquest look like archaeologically, what would come to mind? You might think about something like called a burn layer. That'd be when a settlement is destroyed, burned down, and then you would have that in the archaeology itself. You might think about certain valuables being stripped, et cetera, some things missing from a certain archaeological layer during the destruction. Or you might have villages or settlements abandoned and left behind. Now, the problem is that all of these things, this archaeological evidence, whether a layer of destruction, burning, smashing of buildings, et cetera, bones, mass graves, these sorts of things, just isn't there. We don't have it for the Middle East. And a lot of the archaeology is specifically focused on Greater Syria and specifically Palestine, just because the Israeli Archaeological Service has been a bit more active in this than the Iraqi or Iranians, et cetera. But we do have essentially a very different story. We basically don't have any archaeological evidence for a violent conquest at all. And why is that? How can we think of this contradiction? Because here we have no archaeological evidence of conquest, and then here we have some Christian sources saying that these places were conquered and people were killed. Well, one way to think about it is that the initial conquest was not intended in any way to convert people, and in fact, as we'll see, the early Muslim community was never interested in forcefully converting anyone. And in fact, it was often frowned upon for people to convert, because then they didn't pay as high taxes anymore. So what they actually wanted was just for groups to pay taxes. And those were relatively easy because there was already a tax collecting service before, and all they needed to do was just change who the taxes went to. That said, when we look at places that were being raided, they were most likely villages, places without defensible walls, places that are so small that they wouldn't necessarily leave a clear archaeological record, um, or that they're too minor to be easily worth the work of doing an entire excavation. So we might have had this situation in which nomads were coming in, doing localized raiding, stealing crops and animals, kidnapping people and enslaving them. But when it came to cities, places with walls that were more defensible, very few of those were actually conquered violently. Um, Very few of them were under siege, and it seems that most of the cities basically felt that these nomads from Arabia, under the leadership of Muhammad or as followers of Muhammad, were respectable people enough that they could bargain and come to an agreement about how to surrender and what they had to hand over. And they expected those agreements to be honored, and which they did. Basically, we don't have mass destruction of cities except for one. And we see this also in the archaeological record. Churches continued to be built, continued to be used, at least for 150 years afterwards. So the majority of the population remains Christian, or remains Jewish, and it just continues on with their daily life, essentially paying taxes now instead to the Byzantines, but to their new Muslim overlords, or Arab overlords, of course, depending on which side of that you want to emphasize. And in fact, new often basically about within 20 to 30 years after these conquests, the complaints range no longer from people being having their livestock stolen, or people kidnapped, but having to pay too many taxes, because ultimately these taxes became a major source of income for the occupying or incoming armies. Now, what's most interesting is that the churches actually were not destroyed. Again, there was no forceful conversion. And what we actually see in some cases is churches actually being used as Muslim places of worship. Now, the Prophet Muhammad did establish a mosque, which functioned as a space of communal gathering, discussion, and meeting in Medina. But when they went over to Palestine, for example, where they would end up finding is many Christians, and there they would find churches as houses of worship. And so it was common for them to simply use those as churches, as spaces of worship, not to convert them, just to pray within them. Because ultimately, one of the interesting things is that these were Christian spaces, but Christians were still considered believers, part of that community, and so therefore able to be very much members, or at least their spaces were acceptable as spaces of worship. One of the most interesting things is that in some churches, I think like the one that you find in Katisma, like this one, but even more interesting, like this one in Shvita or Subaita, you actually find kind of the merging of church and mosque architecture. So if you go to a mosque today, it is oriented towards Mecca. And that orientation is, there's a niche like this called a mihrab, and we can actually find churches from that period with mihrabs built into them. So it's clear that basically the new believer community was using churches for their prayers while it was still continuing to be a church. What this suggests again is that we have a more ecumenical community of early believers before Islam had become a sort of separate religious community. It was still seen at this initial period, essentially for the first century, as something compatible with, or at least similar to, Christianity and Judaism. Now, there are cities that were apparently, according to the chronicles, heavily destroyed by the campaigns. So like this city, Caesarea, this is one that was supposedly completely destroyed, but it's hard to tell again how much of it was destroyed by the Arab conquerors, or was it destroyed before, because actually just 8 years prior, say 10 years prior, in 624, this whole city was completely destroyed by the Sasanians when they went on the march and attacked the Byzantines. So there might not have been much to destroy or to continue. And in fact, archaeologically, the space of 10 years is impossible to distinguish. Now, one of the things you should keep in mind is that in Caesarea, there was this very interesting type of church called the church on the temple platform. It was a church on a temple platform. It had an octagonal base and a dome. Keep this in mind because this ends up also forming the basis for one of the first true Muslim buildings, the Dome of the Rock. The other interesting thing is that as these nomads, these Arab nomads and believers came into places and started administering and conquering them, they actually had to deal with the question of, well, how do we collect taxes? How do we create coinage? How are we going to govern a state? Because before in Arabia, there simply wasn't a state. No one was making coins. There were no laws. There was no formal government or administration. There was, of course, tribal leaders who negotiated and dealt with issues on an ad hoc basis between themselves, but there wasn't a formal state with bureaucrats and tax collectors, et cetera, et cetera. And so, not surprisingly, what they did is they just kind of kept the administration that was in place in the Sasanian Empire and in the Byzantine Empire. They kept those clerks and bureaucrats around, and they just had them pay them the proceeds of the taxes. So Greek and Persian continue to be used as languages of administration, and in fact, also the coinage too. Here we see Sasanian coins, and here we see Greek Byzantine coins. But if you look closely, what you'll notice is that here on the left, there's a little piece of Arabic. So they've added the basic, kept the coins, they kept the imagery of the Sasanian emperor here, and then added a little bit of Arabic. I think it says something like Hamdulillah, something Allah, something of God. In here, apparently, it's the name of the mint, if I remember correctly, Homs, but it might also mean something. It might be something else. But all they do is basically take the coins and just add a bit of extra text. For them right now, it's not important if you still have a Byzantine emperor or a Sasanian emperor on the coin. All they want to do is add a little bit of marking to show now that they are in charge. Now, beyond the question of conquest and administration, there's ideas about did the coming of Islam, did the movement of Muslims into these areas like Palestine and Iraq change the very nature of the societies? Did it mark the break from late antique or from antiquity to a different civilization? And earlier, by much earlier, people writing in the 1930s, like this Jean Savaget, a very important art historian and historian of urban spaces, argued that the Islamic conquest brought a different culture to urban centers. So what does that mean? Is that he talks about the difference from the polis means city, to Medina. Medina also means city, but not in Latin or Greek, but in Arabic. And these were different conceptions of what the city was and how it functioned. So for him, to understand this, we have to look at what the city is under a Greek city. A Greek city is about public space, about the role of public areas in the idea of governing the city itself, and the idea that the city has a character, has a charter, has a capacity to exist as a sort of corporate entity in and of itself, a municipality. And that is signified by its religious spaces and its administrative spaces, etc. Often centered around a large public square called the Agora. And again, on a grid pattern, so you can move easily across the main axes of the city. And you can see this in the nature of Roman cities. So there's straight colonnaded streets, you have an open foreign squares, you have public temples, but you also have spaces like theaters and baths, which are meant to be spaces for the people of the city to think of themselves as part of the city. You might think, well, isn't it normal to have straight streets in a grid-like pattern? Now, the reality is no. The reason why our cities are like that today is because we've readopted the Roman model and put it back into our cities starting like the 1600s, 1700s. And specifically, that was done most commonly in North America where you have this attempt to kind of project or build a new type of city in this seen as kind of virgin or wild space. Of course, it wasn't. There was native peoples there, but if they're going to build a city, they're going to build the perfect city, which again was based off by that point based off of Greek or ancient Roman models that they're revisiting. Now, in contrast to the very public and orderly nature of Roman cities, Savage argues, for example, that Islamic cities are not cities. They don't understand themselves as an entity, as a city. There's no public squares. There's no public space for meeting other than the mosque. So religion kind of dominates everything. The streets are winding, revealing the kind of Oriental mind of the space itself. And so if you were to go look at the map of if you were to go look at a place like Tunis, you would just kind of wander through the city, go down these long streets, but they would not be straight boulevards. You would always end up winding back and forth between different alleys and so forth like that. There was no clear way to navigate through the street, and there was no clear way to meet in public space. Now, is any of that true? Did the coming of Islam or Muslims actually signal the death of classical cities or classical Roman thought, et cetera, et cetera? It turns out it's not true at all. Basically, there's a transformation already happening in the cities of the late antique Roman Empire before the Muslims came. How is that happening? Basically, public space, very much like today, is being privatized. It's being turned over to commercial interests, to individual interests. Already, the only public places that they have are churches. Bathhouses become much smaller, so you don't have these large public baths where everyone would gather. Theaters already disappear, so that before theater was kind of a central practice in Roman and Greek cities. By this point, it disappears completely. The theaters become used as pottery kilns. Instead of big carts moving through the city, you have pack animals, and that's partly because the streets, as you can see in this picture, have just become much narrower because the shop owners have been taking over the street, initially putting out canopies and tables, etc., and extending it slowly to more permanent building over the course of decades or a century. So we can see here this is a depiction of a larger street versus here, that same street is being taken over by shops as the street itself becomes narrow and winding. So what this means is that all of these changes that have been blamed to Islam, the so-called Oriental mind, et cetera, is not true at all. It's actually a change that was going in the late antique Roman period as cities became more privatized, individualized, and commercialized. Now, what's actually interesting is that if you actually go to the cities, the Amsar, the garrison towns in which the Arab troops lived in, you find a very different type of city than the sort of Oriental Medina. In these garrison towns, you find the troops that were sent out to conquer these areas. And one of the things is that I think the reason why they kept these garrison towns is one, questions of just military order, keeping, basically nomads who may have wanted to attack or steal things outside of the city itself, so they wouldn't harass the people of the city. Two was also the idea that the believers are a community, they're a pious community, and they don't need to be spoiled or tempted or defiled by contact with non-believers or from city populations. And ultimately, three, the idea is also just to keep the soldiers away from the local population. So just as, for example, American military bases are separate areas, they don't just keep American soldiers in the middle of Okinawa city or in the middle of Rome or Naples in Italy or in Germany, that they keep them basically on military bases. The same idea here with these soldiers, that they needed to maintain a distance between the local population and the conquerors to maintain military readiness. And when you look at the structure of these Ansar, these garrison towns in which the Arab/Muslim troops were kept, what you have is actually a grid pattern here. You have a very orderly rectangular city with a mosque, usually in one corner, and then a central square and intersecting grid streets, because this was just the easiest way to build a new city. All of these places that they were built in Kufa, Basra, Fustat being the first major city at the start of the Nile Delta, close to where the new city of Cairo would be built. Kairouan, Istah, Marv. They're all built outside of any existing population center. Often they became cities in their own right, as we'll see, like Kufa, Basra, and Fustat. Interestingly, though, places like Syria did not have any garrison towns. So we have a lot in Iraq, we have some in Egypt, in Iran, North Africa, Kairouans and Tunis, but we don't have any in Palestine and Syria. So we're going to leave that for now, and we'll come back to the question of more about the nature of the conquests in a later lesson. One thing always to keep in mind is that there's just much less information about what happened in Iraq and Iran at that time, what happened in the Sasanian territories. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon.